Imagine trying to catch a thief who knows exactly how you're going to catch him. Now consider being in the same room with someone who, while analyzing the brains of killers, seems to drift off into his own thoughts that might be darker than you could ever imagine. What would you do if you thought that someone's interest in violence was more than merely academic? These aren't just theoretical questions. They are the chilling truth at the heart of Bryan Kohberger's story. Bryan Kohberger, a Ph.D. student at Washington State University, was not merely an academic. He was a guy captivated by the study of criminal behavior. His life was steeped in criminology, a field he studied with a passion that both impressed and unsettled those around him. This wasn't only an intellectual effort, it was a deep-seated addiction. Kohberger was captivated by the complexity of criminal minds, especially by how killers maintain control and elude capture. His study probed into the methods and motives of the most violent offenders, with a special concentration on understanding their need for power. One day, during a class talk about a known serial killer, Kohberger's eyes glittered with a weird light as he examined the killer's methodology. His peers felt a chill as his analysis took on a dangerously personal tone. It wasn't just the information he knew, it was the way he knew them. As if he wasn't simply studying the killer, but internalizing their skills, possibly even appreciating them. This wasn't simply academic interest, it was something far deeper. As Kohberger's fixation intensified, it started to show in unnerving ways. His contacts with peers became more strained, his tone more aggressive. Conversations that started innocuously would quickly turn into the macabre as he directed them toward the terrible crimes he was so enamored with. The room looked to become colder as he spoke, his words casting a shadow over the air. What his peers originally regarded as normal enthusiasm grew to feel more like a frightening obsession, a red flag they were too uneasy to tackle. Kohberger wasn't content with simply observing these criminals. He seemed to respect their cleverness and their ability to elude capture. He often focused on cases where killers blended into society, using their intelligence to keep one step ahead of the government. His thorough study papers were packed with detailed assessments of notable criminals, exploring their psychological profiles and the concept of control. Kohberger was particularly struck by how these murders pushed their will on others, a theme he returned to again in his work. One terrifying day, Kohberger casually said during a talk that the only reason some killers got caught was because they didn't control every part of their surroundings. If he were in their situation, he reflected, he would ensure that every detail was properly prepared, leaving nothing to chance. This wasn't just a theoretical statement, it was a window into Kohberger's changing mindset. His obsession with control wasn't about understanding crime, it was about mastering it, becoming the perfect criminal in his own right. As his academic journey proceeded, Kohberger's professors began to notice that his interest in criminal psychology was not only cerebral, but very personal. He spoke about his studies with a zeal that bordered on obsessive, often going into gory details of the crimes he studied. His grasp of criminal psychology didn't simply make him an expert, it made him a formidable foe, capable of planning and executing a crime that left an entire country in astonishment. Kohberger's drive for control began to touch every part of his life. He withdrew from social events, spending most of his time alone in his apartment or the library. His behavior grew increasingly erratic, and people who knew him started to worry. There were rumors among his friends and faculty, concerns that Kohberger was pushing his study too far, that his obsession with the brains of killers was becoming more than just academic interest. But no one could have guessed where this road would go. When Bryan Kohberger was arrested in connection with the murders of 4 University of Idaho students, police knew they were dealing with a suspect who was not only brilliant, but intimately educated about the very techniques they would use to profile him. This offered a unique challenge: how to profile someone who had undoubtedly spent years researching how to elude detection, how to disguise the very features that would give him away. The psychological profile that detectives painstakingly cobbled together portrayed a man obsessed by a terrible preoccupation with control and dominance. Kohberger's study of criminal psychology wasn't merely a scholastic goal. It was a mirror reflecting his own dark impulses. In the twisted minds of the killers he examined, he found not monsters, but kindred spirits, figures who held power via bloodshed, who subjugated others to their will in the most cruel manner possible. As investigators looked deeper, they found instances where Kohberger's fixation with control had seeped into his personal life. He carefully prepared every part of group projects, leaving no room for his students to contribute. His urge to control went beyond academics. It was a driving factor in his interactions, his relationships, and finally, in his spiral into violence. Kohberger's metamorphosis was slow, insidious, and marked by an ever-deepening concern with the psychology of violence. His studies, once a real academic pursuit, became a platform for his darkest desires. He began to regard himself as more than just a student of criminal conduct. He saw himself as a participant, someone who could transcend the bounds of academia and enter the world of people he studied. And here's where it becomes even more scary. Kohberger didn't just analyze the perfect crime. He meant to commit it. How does someone change from researching violence to enacting it? And could he truly have thought that he could pull it off without getting caught? The twists in this book are as dark as they are startling. This shift in perspective from observer to participant is a basic component of the psychological profile the scientists created. It revealed not just why Kohberger was so fascinated by the minds of assassins, but why he eventually chose to become one himself. His need for control, his need to dominate, and his faith that he could outsmart those who would want to capture him, all led to his choice to perpetrate the killings. In his mind, this wasn't simply a crime, it was a test, a means to show to himself that he was as intelligent, as cunning, and as strong as the criminals he loved. On the night of November 12, 2022, the small town of Moscow, Idaho, was wrapped in a quiet stillness. It was the kind of night that had always typified this quiet hamlet, where the most pressing problems were the forthcoming examinations or weekend plans of its university students. But that night, an unspeakable nightmare was about to unfold, one that would permanently affect the lives of people who called this town home. Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogan, Zana Kernadle, and Ethan Chapin were 4 students enjoying the freedom and company of college life. They were ordinary young adults, full of goals, hopes, and plans for the future. That night, they had spent the evening in the company of friends, their laughter filling the air as they made their way back to their off-campus house. It was a night like any other, filled with the promise of safety and rest. But hiding in the shadows was a predator, someone who had spent years planning for this very moment. As the town of Moscow slept, the quiet hunter made his move. In the early hours of November 13th, the serene silence was broken by an act of unimaginable violence. The 4 students, once lively and full of life, were ruthlessly killed in their house. The sight that awaited law enforcement was one of mayhem and brutality, a dramatic contrast to the calm that had preceded it. The neighborhood, long known for its peacefulness, was now the epicenter of a nightmare. Now, consider this. What if the person involved had been learning how to get away with it for years? What if he had carefully planned every step from the crime itself to how he would elude capture? As we delve into the case, you'll see just how carefully this crime was orchestrated and how a single error would unravel it all. The discovery of the crime sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. The town of Moscow, with its close-knit citizens and strong sense of security, was suddenly plunged into a state of panic and disbelief. How could something so awful happen here, in a place where such violence was nearly unheard of? The community was left to face with the reality of what had happened as the hunt for the perpetrator began in earnest. With the finding of the knife sheath at the crime site, the story took a dramatic turn. The DNA evidence found on the sheath matched that of Bryan Kohberger, but detectives understood that this was merely the beginning. They needed to make a case to connect the dots between Kohberger and the crime, and to understand what had driven him to commit such a horrific act. Digital forensics played a vital part in this procedure. Investigators went through Kohberger's digital trace, looking for any proof that might place him at the scene of the crime. Geolocation data from his gadgets, including GPS and Wi-Fi connections, was studied to follow his movements on the night of the murders. Surveillance footage from around the area was also studied, with particular attention given to a white Hyundai Elantra that had been seen near the victim's home on the night of the crime. This car, as it turned out, belonged to Kohberger. The proof against Kohberger continued to accumulate. His car was seen on different security cameras in the neighborhood of the crime scene, circling the area in what appeared to be an attempt to monitor the residents. This, together with the DNA evidence and digital forensics, provided a devastating picture. Kohberger was not simply a suspect. He was the top suspect in one of the most terrible crimes in recent memory. As the investigation continued, Kohberger's life was put under a microscope. Investigators went into his past, looking for any signs that could explain his plunge into violence. What they found was a man who had become increasingly isolated, whose fixation with criminal psychology had taken him down a dark and twisted road. His relationships with peers, his academic work, and his online activity all pointed to a man who was not just captivated by violence, but who identified with those who did it. The psychological picture that emerged was that of a guy driven by a quest for control and power. Kohberger's preoccupation with criminal activity had led him to think that he could outsmart law enforcement, that he could perform the ideal crime. But in the end, it was his own arrogance, his belief in his own superiority, that would prove his death. In the early hours of December 30th, 2022, Bryan Kohberger was caught in a spectacular pre-dawn raid at his family's house in Pennsylvania. The arrest was the culmination of weeks of intense investigation, during which law enforcement officers from numerous jurisdictions worked together to build a case against him. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community and the country. The man who had studied the brains of criminals, who had committed his academic life to understanding what drives people to commit such acts, was now accused of being one himself. The legal battle that happened was nothing short of a war with lives and legacies hanging in the balance. Kohberger's defense team fought the prosecution's case with an intensity that equaled the savagery of the crimes he was accused of, casting doubt on the DNA evidence, doubting the precision of the digital forensics, and attacking the very eyes that had seen him on surveillance tape. Meanwhile, the prosecution fought with similar vigor, knowing that their pursuit of justice was more than just a legal obligation. It was a fight for the soul of a community torn by evil. The shockwaves of the murders traveled through every part of the community, inflicting scars that would never fully heal. The University of Idaho, once a sign of safety and promise, now stood under a shadow of fear and loss. The picturesque campus, once brimming with life and laughter, now resonated with whispers of doubt and despair. The psychological profile of Bryan Kohberger, the student who became a suspect, is a subject of major attention. What drove him to commit such a heinous act? Was it a result of his thorough immersion in the study of criminal minds, or were there other elements at play? These worries linger as the trial looms and the hunt for justice continues. The Idaho University killings are a sobering warning of the risks of unbridled obsession and the dark possibilities within the human psyche. This instance underlines the significance of vigilance in both academic settings and larger communities. It pushes colleges to find the balance between supporting academic independence and safeguarding against unhealthy fixations. Ultimately, this tragedy serves as a clear warning of the effects when psychic darkness is left unchecked. As we close the chapter on this deeply unsettling yet captivating case, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Your reflections mean a lot, not just to us, but to the larger conversation around this story. When you engage with our videos, it truly motivates the Motion Mysteries team to keep bringing you well-researched, true crime stories that spread important insights and information. If you found value in this deep dive, liking the video helps us know we're on the right track, and it helps others discover stories like this too. And if you'd like to be a part of more compelling narratives, consider subscribing to Motion Mysteries. Your support makes all the difference in bringing these stories to light. Thank you for being here with us.